Okay, okay. But do you think also, this designation can lead to increased a legal risk of migrants, accused of association with such groups?
hmm Yeah, it does open up new grounds of inadmissibility, or it makes people, qualified to be in grounds of inadmissibility that would prevent them from getting visas or admission into the U.S. if they've been labeled. The problem with that is the way that USCIS in particular and DHS has been dealing with these issues of inadmissibility is completely illegal. What they're supposed to do when they take an adverse action against somebody is they're supposed to give them notice, they're supposed to give them opportunity to respond to the allegation, and then they're supposed to make a decision in writing and give that explaining the law and the facts that their decision is based on. What we see DHS and USCIS doing, however, is they're entering these findings in secret, not telling anybody. And the only time you ever find out about these findings is when you go to a consulate for a visa stamp or you go to the port of entry for admission. And that's when you find out that you've been, listed as inadmissible for one of these categories. And I see that all the time in regards to alleged false statements, inadmissibility based on false statements. And am suspecting that we're going to see that happening with the terrorism related grounds, is that they will just start using that incredibly freely without a whole lot of thought or discretion, and it's going to be a tool they use to eliminate a lot of people from the pool of those that can come to the U.S.
Okay, okay. Thank you for answering the question, John. Also, what could happen if military is used for border enforcement?
You know, so the border enforcement is an interesting question. It's an easier question to say, can we send the military south of the border to combat narco terrorism? Legally, yes, I think we can do that. I think, practically it would be a horrible idea. Border enforcement's another issue, though. It's quite a bit different and it's more nuanced. So there's this thing called the Posse Comitatus Act. And it goes all the way back to post Civil War when the US Army was occupying the South. And they were the law enforcement, for the South in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And part of the compromise of ending Reconstruction, getting the levers of power restored to the civilians in the South, was the Posse Comitatus Act that said that the U.S. military will not be allowed to enforce civil law, and they have no authority to do that in the United States. And so, the question is whether or not border enforcement, which is on our side of the border, would violate Posse Comitatus. And I think, the U.S. military could serve in a supporting role legally to CBP, like logistics and things like that, because they're not enforcing law. But once they start putting the military into an enforcement role, there becomes a whole lot of problems with the Posse Comitatus Act. And I think that's something that it's a little bit more nuanced, but I think it's also something that the administration will lose in court.
Okay, okay. So, also, how might stopping asylum and refugee admissions affect international human rights?
Yeah, so the asylum and refugee issue, it's a program that in theory is very valuable and it's very noble. What the Trump administration, I think, is responding to is pretty well documented cases of abuse of that noble policy. And yeah, there are pretty good documented cases of people that are just running these asylum mills where they give people these backstories, they prep them for these interviews based on facts that never actually happened to the person, and then they send them for their asylum or their refugee screening. And that's probably the minority of cases by far, but it's something that has happened in the past, and I think that's what they're responding to is the abuse in the asylum system. I think for the legitimate folks that are truly impacted by you know, oppression in their home country, it's going to be a catastrophe. They're going to be stuck in refugee camps. They're going to be stuck in their home country with really no protection or no sense of certainty of what's going to happen in their future. But again, asylum and refugee policy is something that the law does give the president a lot of discretion over and how he administers it. So it's something that's probably not going to be very easy to challenge in court.
Okay. Okay. And John, with this, I would also like to talk about, the government and workplace changes. So I would like to know from you that what might happen legally if diversity and inclusion programs are ended in federal agencies?
If there were which programs, sorry?
If diversity and inclusion programs.
City inclusion programs?
Yeah, diversity and inclusion programs.
Oh. Yeah, so the DEI stuff or yeah, I think that's any mandatory or encouragement on the federal level is going to probably end if it hasn't ended already. Individual states, individual cities, they're completely allowed to have their own policies on that. However, it remains to be seen how courts are going to handle challenges to that under the Equal Protection Clause. So as we look at the history of affirmative action and how that's fared in courts, the current Supreme Court, being very conservative, they have a view of the Equal Protection Clause that says that you can't give preference based on race to anybody, even if it is somebody who's been historically oppressed or disadvantaged. It has to be race neutral. And I think where these DEI policies are going to run into problems is, when they're giving preference to certain categories of folks and disadvantaging others, that's going to have equal protection ramifications. And that's something that, in theory, the federal government could proactively sue the municipality or the state on.
Okay, but do you think that cutting federal jobs, can face constitutional challenges?
No, it would. Let me put it this way. If Congress authorizes money, then the president's hands are limited because Congress has said this is how we want to spend our money, and this is the only way you can spend that money. So as long as Congress keeps pumping out the money, the executive branch, is in charge of spending it and has to spend it typically. If Congress is working with the executive in cutting jobs, it's very easy. There's no constitutional issue involved. The only time there becomes a constitutional issue is a separation of powers issue between Congress and the executive. If there's a disagreement there about how the law is being enforced and whether or not the executive is faithfully executing the laws that Congress has created, then that's an issue that can come about. One way that they typically are going to do things like this is not overtly. It'll be attrition, hiring freezes, pushing people out through retirement, just subtle changes in process as opposed to outright layoffs and firings to eliminate positions. So I would expect it to be death by 1,000 paper cuts as opposed to, chopping the head off the snake.
Okay. John, thank you so much for answering all these questions. With this, I would also like to know your viewpoints on that the CBP app shutting down. So I would also like to know from you that how will the sudden shutdown of the CBP One app impact nearly 1 million migrants who had scheduled legal entry appointments?
Yeah, I think it's just indicative of where the Trump administration is headed. They want to make life as difficult as possible for people trying to enter the U.S. And that's simple, full stop. They are under no obligation to to make things easy. They're in charge of creating process. They're in charge of dictating how services are delivered. And if they throw up obstacles or they eliminate efficiencies, it's annoying, especially if you're an immigration lawyer or you're the person impacted. But it's something courts are not likely to get involved in and tell the executive, no, this is the process you must follow. So as long as they're not overtly doing something illegal, those process type of issues tend to get a pass in court.
So then, what legal challenges can migrants potentially can take against the abrupt cancellation of their pre-approved appointments?
So not much on that. There's if they're outside the country, especially, you have very few rights when you're outside the country, and the executive branch is given a lot of authority to determine, who can enter the U.S. And if you don't have a right to enter the U.S., then you clearly don't have a right to a scheduled appointment. So I don't expect that there's going to be a whole lot of legal challenge to that aspect.
Okay, so John, also does the executive order violate any existing immigration regulation or international asylum protocols?
Well, the international asylum protocols probably, but the Trump administration has never really shown themselves to be big fans of international law, and international law is one of those things that is tough because it's all based on agreement to cooperate and to follow. And if somebody opts out of following international law, there's really not a whole lot that you can do, especially when you're the biggest kid on the block. You're the one spending money to support the UN, and you're the most powerful country in the world. There's not much people can do to punish you for violating international law and conventions like this.
Okay. And what immediate risks do migrants face after having their appointment suddenly cancelled?
Just being stuck in place where they're at. I think that's the unfortunate situation is just they're on hold and their lives are on hold while they're waiting for those appointments.
Mm-hmm. And how might this action potentially increase unauthorized border crossings?
So, interestingly, right now, illegal border crossings that are kind of at a historic low, they're greatly decreased during the Biden administration. So I don't know how much of an effect it'll have because typically the unauthorized border crossings are more a reflection of disruption and problems in people's home countries more than anything. And the lack of border crossings that we've seen, I think, is indicative of countries starting to get more stability and addressing their internal problems, which takes away the incentive for people to leave. So I'm not sure how that'll play out.